What I love most about Mi Gente is our community and how important it is to take care of our own.
Hey, it's Honey and Carolina. On our podcast, Life in Spanglish, we talk about how important being there for your loved ones is.
Pero también sobre lo importante que es tener a alguien dispuesto a apoyarte cuando lo necesites, como lo hace State Farm.
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Aprende más en es.statefarm.com.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and the Pavilion with Stephen Wallace. In each show, Stephen will interview someone connected to the world of horse racing or cricket.
Hello everyone. Next month, the England Test side are due to play a 3-test series in the Caribbean. And to get you in the mood, today's guest is author Colin Babb, who recently wrote 1973 and Me, the England versus West Indies Test series, and a memorable childhood year. Thank you for joining me, Colin.
Hello, it's great to be here, Stephen. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to quote something from Colin Grant, historian, author and broadcaster, who described the book as a vital account of the spirit, dynamism and cultural transformation of cricket brought about by West Indian cricketers.
Well, I can't beat that, can I? What can I say? What a very apt description.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Colin. I would say that was pretty much sums up what the book is in part. But what it is, it's autobiographical in many ways. It's my story, my childhood, brought up in the 1970s in Britain and more specifically South London, where I was living at the time. And the spine of the book, you might say, is a 1973 West Indies tour of England, and which was very important for me because it was the tour that hooked me on Test cricket, West Indies cricket, and I would say the game in general. It just confirmed my interest in the sport. And what was important when I look back on that tour is that we should remember that from 1968 to 1973, the West Indies did not win a Test series. And when they came to England in 69, their previous visit to England, they lost 2-0. So 73 was an important year for the potential regeneration of West Indies cricket. And the question was, could it happen on English soil?
Well, thank you for that. Could you let me know a bit more about your own background?
My father's from Barbados and my mother's from Guyana. And I was brought up mainly in South London. And the book is set in the 70s. And I was living in Streatham in South London at the time from 1970, 71 to 79, 80. So it was a very important part of my life. I was growing up, settling into another school, making friends, finding out about myself, finding out about my personality and my identity. I didn't have any brothers and sisters, so it was just me. My great-grandmother was living with us. She was from Guyana. So I was surrounded really by strong Caribbean personalities in my house, or my flat, I should say. And outside, I mixed with anybody. Most of my friends were a mixture of English, West Indian and South Asian, a bit of a mixed bag of all sorts of people. So, that was my life. And I spent a lot of time entertaining myself because I was left to my own devices a lot. My mother was working very hard. My grandmother would go to sleep fairly early. My dad was in the army, often away. So I spent a lot of time finding out about myself and making my own entertainment. And one of the things I used to do a lot with my family and with myself or by myself was watch television. And television was the root of many things for me. And it was my guide and my link to sport. And I would say certainly this first sport that I fell in love with was football, and particularly Leeds United. I won't mention, this is a family show, so there are many other things people called Leeds United in those days. But I was obsessed with football in many ways. And that was my number one sport through the TV, through Match of the Day on a Saturday night when I was allowed to stay up. And on Sunday, the big match with Brian, the voice of football more. But that changed when the 1973 series took off, the build up to that. And also there are one or two hints that cricket was going to be a strong competitor to football, because I can just about remember before the 1973 tour watching Lancashire v Gloucestershire. It was a Gillette Cup semi-final, and I just have a dim, distant memory of watching this game. And I think it was 71, and the match seemed to go on and on and on, and it was very dark. Through our black and white TV, I could get the sense it was quite dark. And David Hughes hit a 6 and a 4 and a 4 and a 6 or something, and Mike Proctor was charging in, bowling as quickly as possible, and the crowd kept on running on the pitch and running off the pitch. And that was the first sense of watching cricket on television that made me feel excited about the game. And then it dampened down for a while, and then it rose again when I fell in love with the Lancashire team of the early 70s. I think most of your listeners who are of a certain age would remember that team with Clive Lloyd, David Lloyd, Farouk Engineer, Peter Lee. Who else was in that team? Frank Hayes, Harry Pilling. I can still remember these names.
Yeah, my brother was a Lancashire fan, and I fondly remember the game. John Mortimer was bowling to David Hughes in 1971, and
that's correct.
I think the game finished just before the news came on at 9:00. That's how dark it was.
Yeah, and David Lloyd tells a story where one of the Lancashire players goes up to one of the umpires and questions the light. And I think the umpire, whose name I forget, said, well, can you see the moon? Well, if you can see the moon, how far do you want to see? Quite a famous story. But yeah, that really aroused my passion, so to speak. And then again, I forgot to talk about the bridge that led to 73, which was the John Player League. Again, something that some people have forgotten, that live cricket was on every single Sunday. You could watch the counties play each other in a 40-over competition called the JPL, the John Player League. When we look back, it's amazing that you could watch a sporting event sponsored by a cigarette company. Of course, you wouldn't get anywhere near that now. But yeah, I mean, I was able to watch a lot of the West Indian players that I heard my friends and family talk about in the house play for county teams every single weekend, and that was a way of arousing my interest in West Indian players and the West Indies team. So yeah, growing up in that flat in South London, where we had Jamaican neighbours downstairs, Jamaican neighbours to our left, and Irish neighbours to our left, the Jewish neighbours to our right, and we had different types of people living on the street. Not everybody got on with each other. Some did, some didn't. But there wasn't a heightened sense of tension. A few disputes now and again, but we rubbed along with each other. And, I had friends from all different types of backgrounds that I got on with pretty well. And we used to play out, it was all about going out, wasn't it? It wasn't about staying in, it was going out. There was nothing to do in the house, 3 channels on the TV. But one of the things that pulled me in was every summer, if there was a cricket series, which there always was, it seems, even if England were playing a team that I wasn't that interested in, I'd watch it. I wasn't an England fan. I supported the West Indies. Brought up in a West Indian household. Everybody supported the West Indies. It was my way of connecting with my West Indian identity. But if England were playing Pakistan or India or anybody else, I'd watch it. I'd watch every single series. From the start of the music, I'd be there at 11:15, sitting on the sofa or lying on the floor, I'd watch it. Then I'd go out, play with my friends, and run in after lunch, go out, play with my friends. If the match was boring, I'd stay out and play a bit more. Or I might listen to the radio in my bedroom. Well, not listening, not particularly interested in the game, but just as background. And then if something happened, I'd run and watch the action on the TV.
What inspired you then to write the book? Was it the West Indies coming in that particular year?
Well,
and was it your first ever book?
Yeah, well, this is my third book, you could say, that I've written by myself. I wrote They Gave the Crowd Plenty Fun, which was about the history of the relationship between West Indian cricket and the Caribbean community in Britain. Then I rewrote that. I wrote a second version, a more expanded version of that. And of course, well, not of course, this book, 1973 and Me, is the third book for Hansard Publications, who have supported me all the way through. Fantastic company run by a guy and his family, the Ali family. And the main reason I wrote it was I was thinking about what can I use as a spine for my next book. And then I thought about 1973, the first series I watched on television. Then I thought about the fact that for that series, my dad bought a colour TV, just to watch that on TV, so we could see the ball was red, the grass was green, and all the rest of it. And also, the other main thing was that when I realised that 1973 was the tour I wanted to write about, I started to develop ideas around that year and about myself and about other events that were happening, i.e. Britain joined the Common Market. CARICOM, which I suppose is a Caribbean version of the EU, was formed. Leeds United lost to Sunderland in probably one of the most dramatic FA Cup finals of all time. I haven't got over that. Eurovision Song Contests, Miss World contests, the political situation at the time in Britain, Ted Heath, the leader of the Conservative Party, who was the Prime Minister, Howard Wilson, who was the leader of the opposition, various comedy shows that were on at the time, the culture of watching television. So that was the base. The tour and my connection with that tour and how important it was for me was the base. But then all these ideas started to flurry out. And then I kind of tried to catch these ideas before they disappeared, gather them together and wrote the book around that. So this book isn't just about my experience, it's about other people's experiences, because I've received input from friends and acquaintances and other people who heard about the project, got involved. And the central part of that was the fact that I managed to interview cricketers who played in the series for the West Indies and England. Maurice Foster, Lance Gibbs, Keith Fletcher, Frank Hayes, Ron Headley, who made his overdue debut for the West Indies that series.
So you had a lot of material to work on, Colin. How long a project was it?
I think from start to finish, it was roughly around 18 months, 18 months to 2 years, from coming up with the idea, sending it to the publishing company and having it approved, as it were, and then doing the research, making the list of different types of books I needed to read, magazines, listening to old radio programs, watching clips of test matches from that year, 1973, and then listing. Well, it sounds quite crude, but I literally wrote down all the players from England and the West Indies who played in that series, and unfortunately some of them have passed away, so I had to realistically think about who I could target. And then once I found out who the players who were still with us, I found a way of contacting them, either through the clubs they used to play for or from friends of mine in the media, with inverted commas, who had contact details. Yeah, and just became very persistent in finding where these people were. And the bulk of the book is the stories shared by many of the people who were involved in the series, who thankfully gave up some time, and I just recorded their thoughts, memories, and stories, and that was a very, very much a key part of the content in the book. But also, I managed to speak again, thankfully, to Dickie Bird, who, of course, was the umpire in the second test at Edgbaston. Yes, he was, certainly, and the third test at Lord's. And also some people who came via social media who were spectators at these matches. I use various methods to get people to come through and to talk. And so, that was the main body of the book. Yeah. By the way, I've got to mention my journalist friend Reza Abazali from Trinidad. He's a cricket historian and journalist and broadcaster in Trinidad. And I promised to give him a mention because he's helped me a lot in this book. He did the interview with Bernard Julian in Trinidad and gave me the audio, for example. So he's really helped me a lot. I also relied on my memory to delve into the past, my personal past, and to get that on paper. And also other people's memories and stories So yeah, that was a basis for the book in many ways. And the more I wrote, the more I wanted to write, the more people came forward, and I added their stories as well.
And we're going to talk about the series, the 3 test matches shortly. But one question I really wanted to ask you is, after doing all the research and even after writing the book and speaking to all these different people, how did you, because you were, how old were you in 1973? 1973,
I was 9 going on 10. So let me calculate that. Yes, I was, yes. I had to think about that. Yeah. I was 9 going on 10. So basically, a lot of the matches that I saw, I couldn't remember everything, but I remembered some of it. So I had to speak to people, i.e. the players, and other people who were actually at the ground to remind me of what happened.
But I wanted to ask you, before talking a bit about the test matches, how did you feel as a mid-50-year-old feel after you'd written the book and gathered all the information?
Yeah, well, I think what I found priceless was just people's individual stories and memories of that year, particularly the players. I mean, some of the things that some of the players said to me, I couldn't put in the book because they were quite personal. I didn't want to get into any legal wrangles. But yeah, just some of the things that Ron Headley was saying to me. Ron made his debut in the first test at the Oval in the 73 series, West Indies v England. And, he'd been overlooked for many years, and he managed to get his chance. His father was George Headley, a West Indian legend. His son is Dean, who played for England eventually. But often, I think the story of, Ron's story hasn't really come to the fore, and I really wanted to bring that out, his background, how he got into the West Indies team, and, why he didn't perhaps get picked earlier on. I thought that was really interesting. Also, finding out a little bit more about the political situation in Guyana at the time, which is very important for me, being of Guyanese heritage, to remind myself of that and how that played into the Guyanese community here. Also, finding out a bit more about the 73 Cup final, because it was quite emotional for me as a Leeds fan watching Leeds lose to Sunderland. But, finding out the stories behind that match and why 1 or 2 players didn't play as well as they did. So that was kind of interesting for me, really, just digging into the past and finding out more about it and mixing that up with my memories.
Well, the West Indies first came in a test tour to England in 1928, but reading your book, they came earlier than that on 2 or 3 tours, I think, didn't they?
Yes, yeah, they first turned up here, you might say, in 1900, but it was all legitimised, you might say, in 1928 when they came for their first test series. And of course, in 1950, they won their first test series on English soil. And at Lord's in 1950, of course, lovely cricket, they won their first test match with Ramadan and Valentine, the spin twins. And I think that's really important, that history, because I listened to that history subconsciously when I was on Friday nights. We'd have family and friends gathering around in our flat from different parts of the Caribbean. And cricket was often the central part of the conversation, especially between the men, and the dominoes and the rum and everything else that was going on, and the noise, and my job of filling up people's drinks and getting a glass of ginger ale as a reward. All this was going on, but cricket and politics were often at the fore of the conversation. And that's how I subconsciously find out. And that's how I kind of find out about the history of a lot of the players going back to the 30s, 40s and 50s, because I heard their names mentioned in the house with a deep reverence. Moving on to the 50s, 60s and 70s, people like the 3 Ws, Frank Worrell, Everton Weekes, Clyde Walcott, and then Ramadan and Valentine, of course, and later on Clive Lloyd, Joe Sullivan, Rohan Kanhai, Wes Hall, Charlie Griffith. All these players were mentioned in deep reverential tones. I'd never seen them, but it was a sense of history for me, which was very important. And obviously all of these players came here on tours to England in the 50s and 60s.
And of course, you mentioned someone there. Sir Frank Worrell was the first sort of long-term black captain of the West Indies.
Yes, he was. And when the West Indies came here on the 63 tour, I mean, that was very, very important. And what I like to talk about, and I mentioned this sense of history in the book, because obviously 73 is the pivotal year, which I talk about. But there's lots of build-up to the book about the past, and I think that's very important. And 63 was very important when Sir Frank Worrell came here as a statesman-like figure, probably as important, if not more important, than any political figure in the Caribbean. And he arrives in England and leads a West Indian team on English soil, a black figurehead. I mean, that was very, very important for many of the Caribbean people in Britain to see a black leader coming out of the Caribbean. Years before many of the countries in the Caribbean were fully independent. So this is very important. And Sir Frank Worrell had a vision to unite the Caribbean in terms of the players on the field. So he particularly was against the sectarian nature of cricket in the Caribbean in terms of the way teams toured. He wanted to see Trinidadians, Guyanese, Jamaicans, and everyone else work together to combine their efforts for the West Indies and for the West Indies people, particularly on English soil. Obviously, that was something that Clive Lloyd instituted as well in the 70s. But Sir Frank Worrell really initiated that idea and doesn't get enough credit for it. So, yeah, that tour was very, very, very important, and his leadership skills were very important. And Derek Murray acknowledges those leadership skills and abilities in the book.
Well, moving forward then to 10 years later to 1973, we've got a very strong Guyanese connection with the captain, vice-captain in Rohan Kanhai, Lance Gibbs. We've got Clive Lloyd. We've also got Alvin Kalacharan and Steve Camacho, who is on the tour.
Yeah. I mean, that was important for me as a Guyanese person in Britain to see these Guyanese people coming over. And I think that's what cricket was important, not just for me, but for many people in the Caribbean community here, that, you know, there were people coming to represent us. They're almost our ambassadors. And it was so important for me to see these players come over and represent the people here. And I guess it was very important for me to see these figures come over, because Guyana is a kind of a mysterious place for many people outside the Caribbean, because it's located in northern South America. Historically, politically, and culturally, it's very much connected with the rest of the English-speaking islands in the Caribbean. So, of course, cricket culture is very important in Guyana. And going back to the 1800s, when Guyana played Barbados, it was the first inter-Caribbean contest in the region. So, yeah, it was of utmost importance for me to see Guyanese people coming here representing the team, which is something that is crucial, really, to the way the team connects with the Caribbean community, in that the divisions in the community are quite strong. You know, like any part of the world, you know, if you come from one part of the region, it doesn't mean you're going to get on with somebody from another part of the region. So if you're from Jamaica, it doesn't necessarily mean you would have met a Trinidadian unless you met one in England. So you had many people from the Caribbean who came to Britain in the 60s, 50s and 60s and 70s in the main, who didn't really know much about other people in other islands, or had not met anybody from St. Kitts. If you were from Jamaica, or if you were from Guyana, you might not have met someone from Dominica. If you were from Barbados, you might not have met someone from Grenada, for example. Possibly yes, possibly no. But in England, all of these people generally rubbed on. Sometimes they didn't get on with each other, sometimes they didn't. But they had a similar migrant reality to face, racism and prejudice. And also a cricket team they could focus on, the West Indies, who were, I would say, a unifier in exile. We could all get together and watch the West Indies for 5 days of a test match, support them, and be as one, regardless of our island differences or racial differences.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point you make, because I think a lot of people often forget that we are, the West Indies is made up of so many different islands, countries, where I think people, there's this imaginary country called the West Indies that doesn't actually exist, you know. It's
a false creation if you think about it. It was basically a collection of English-speaking colonial territories bound together to form an international cricket team. The whole, how can I say, the way this changed, or was forced to change in some ways, was when some of these countries became independent in the 60s and 70s. So then you had a collection of nation states, basically independent nation states, coming together to form a cricket team, which in the world of international cricket is quite unique. In fact, there isn't any other international team like it. So these are real challenges that historically the West Indies has had to face. But also it's had to face it in the Caribbean where, for example, there are stories of West Indian teams playing in one island and one or two players from that home island haven't been selected, and it's caused a real rumble of discontent. And so that's why, in a way, and I write about this in the book, from my observation, the spectator experience in England was very different, because generally in Trinidad in the 60s and the 50s and maybe in the 70s, if you went to a test match and the West Indies were at home to anybody, most of the people in the crowd would be Trinidadians. You go to Jamaica, most of the people would be Jamaicans. Test match at Border in Guyana, most of the people would be Guyanese. But in Britain, in England, it was a mixed bag. People from all over the Caribbean supporting the West Indies team. So I think in that way, it was quite a unique spectator-team relationship. It was very, very different. And I know for a fact one or two of the players found that comforting in a way that they weren't playing to a hostile home crowd of Trinidadians or Guyanese. They were playing to a mixed crowd of people from the Caribbean who were supporting them and who wanted them to do well.
The 3 test series was pretty dramatic. We had 3 scores of 150 by West Indian players. We had a test debut 100 by an England player. Sir Garfield, one of those players that got over 150, well, he got actually 150 not out at Lords, which is his final test century, his 26th and final test century. We also had a bomb scare at Lords. And reading your book, the first ever Women's World Cup finished just at the same time as the first test was starting at the Oval.
Well, that's correct. I know we talked earlier about one or two things that I might have discovered in my research which stuck in my mind, and I didn't even know that there was a Women's World Cup during that year. So that was something I discovered and had to write about, because obviously that was 2 years before the Men's World Cup. So in a way, women's cricket was ahead of its time, in that way. Yes, it was a very eventful series, full of incident. I've obviously detailed it in the book. So if you want it, you'll have to contact colinbabbauthor.com to find out more. But there was all sorts going on. And it was fantastic to speak to Dickie Bird to tell me his tale of how he wanted to protect the covers in the third test at Lords when there was a bomb scare, and a lot of the spectators wandered onto the pitch but couldn't get to the hallowed wicket because Dickie Bird had it covered. Not only did he have it covered, a lot of the spectators decided to sit on the covers. And Dickie was having this conversation with many of them, and he told me that some of the West Indies were saying to him, "Don't worry about the bomb scare, just look at that scoreboard. West Indies 600 odd for 7 or for 5 or whatever." So, lots of great stories. Yes, and interestingly, we were talking about the Guyanese contribution to cricket during that tour for the West Indies. I mean, it's interesting to note that in the first test, Clive Lloyd scored a century. In the second test, Roy Frederick scored a century. And in the third test, Rohan Kanhai scored a century. So we had 3 Guyanese centurions in each of the test series. And you're right, it was a very strong Guyanese contingent in that team, with Kallicharan and Kanhai and Lloyd and Gibbs and Camacho. And Fredericks. But Camacho was unlucky. Steve Camacho was unlucky during that series. He didn't get to play in the test series because in a pre-test match, tour match at Hampshire, he got hit on the head by a young, aspiring fast bowler called Andy Roberts. The injury, I think he ducked into a bouncer, put him out of the series, and he didn't play test cricket again. So that was it for poor Steve Camacho, and that's how Ron Headley was selected to replace him. But there was a strong Guyanese contingent, and they all did very well and scored plenty of runs. But yeah, a lot happened during that series, and there were plenty of pitch invasions by young boys, young enthusiastic spectators, and older spectators who should have known better ran on the pitch. There was a lot of pitch invasions, and when I watched that during the 73 series, I just imagined that was what cricket was. People just ran onto the pitch at every given opportunity. But obviously, it wasn't what cricket was supposed to be. But it was during that time. And it changed the way I watched it, because when I used to go to cricket with my friends later in years to come, we used to make sure we were on the boundary and run on the pitch and field the ball. And yeah, it was all part of the game. It was just fun, to just jump up and down the boundary and run on the pitch. I mean, obviously these things don't happen now, and they probably shouldn't from a security perspective. But yeah, that was all part of the fun, And also, when I went to watch matches, I mean, a lot of the book is about me watching matches on TV. But when I started to go to games, even though I supported the West Indies and some of my West Indian friends supported the West Indies, we would go with some of our English friends who supported England, and we just have a great time. There wasn't real hostility between us and them. We were just young kids enjoying the cricket, supporting the team. And that was the thing about the 70s in many ways, is that the connection between the team and the supporters, particularly West Indian supporters, wasn't just about people who are cricket enthusiasts going to watch the team and hoping they would win. A lot of families, West Indian families, would go to the match, bring their food, have a drink, and watch the game, meet people they hadn't seen for years. It wasn't just about the cricket on the pitch. It was about meeting people. These cricket grounds were a venue. They were an outdoor venue for people coming together and having fun, and an outdoor meeting place. And the cricket just happened to be what was going on the pitch. Many people I know who were West Indian weren't cricket fans, but they wanted the West Indies to win. So it was an outlet of frustration. It was a celebration of being West Indian in England, and the cricket was all part of it.
So you think the actual results of that series, West Indies won 2-0, they won at the Oval and at Lord's, and there was a draw at Edgbaston. Frank Hayes was the debut, scoring 100.
He was. You did mention Frank, and I should actually mention Frank and mention the fact that there were many English players that I liked. It wasn't just about me supporting the West Indies and not liking the English. No. There are many English players I liked, and Frank Hayes was one of them. He scored on debut a ton, which a few people in the book talk about how important that was for Frank. But yeah, he was a very important player in my admiration for cricketers in the 70s. He had blonde hair, he was very striking, he seemed quite a good-looking young man, and he batted with flair. Ron Headley told me he felt that at times Frank Hayes batted almost like a West Indian. Yeah, wonderful, all part of that 70s Lancashire team. So yeah, it was great to see Frank get that century, and there are one or two people in the book who talk about that, including one or two Yorkshire supporters in the book who actually quite like the fact that Frank got his century, even though he was a Lancastrian, because he was from the north. And as you're aware, certainly throughout the history of cricket, there have often been arguments about people from the north not having enough representation in the team, etc. So yeah, that was important for many people to see Frank get his tongue.
And from people who were sons and daughters of people of the Windrush generation, do you feel that this Test series in 1973 helped them in the community as well?
Yeah, it was crucial because up to then, most of the people who watched cricket when the West Indies came over were people who came over from the Caribbean. If you look at the 57, 63, 66 and 69 tours when the West Indies came over, I would say that the majority of the West Indian supporters were West Indians who had come over here, or young people who came over here when they were very young. But in the 70s, that began to change because you had people who were born here with West Indian parents, or with one West Indian parent or another non-West Indian parent, because during the 70s and 80s, many people were born here who were dual heritage, half West Indian and half not West Indian. But those who wanted to support the West Indies, who were born here, started to go to matches. So you had a bit of a first and second generation combination crowd, which is quite unique in the 70s. That's how the crowd began to change. and began to evolve. And many people who were born here, whether they like cricket or not, saw the West Indies team as a sense of representation. It was their way of hitting back against people who they felt were getting on top of them. So if we could beat the English at cricket, it was just our way of maybe feeling good about ourselves for those 5 days of a test match. Despite the difficult relationships we might have had with the police forces, despite the difficult relationships we had in terms of wider society, employment, housing, job opportunities, it gave us a bit of respite seeing the West Indies do well. And that was for the first generation, people who came here and people who were born here with Caribbean roots. It was a way of connecting with home, particularly those who were born here who had not been to the West Indies, did not travel back for any reason. This is a way of connecting with home. And also for many of the generation who came here in the 60s and 70s, who maybe went back to the West Indies every 3 or 4 years for family reasons or so, but didn't go back so often. So that was a connection with home, having to connect with players who came here to represent them. And I know of stories where people had gone to watch the West Indies at Edgbaston or Old Trafford or Lords or at the Oval, and had met people that they went to primary school, for example, in Barbados, who they didn't even realise were actually living in England. So you had these fantastic situations in the crowd at the time. But it was certainly a way of gluing some elements of the first generation of migrants who came here from the Caribbean with those who came here when they were younger or those who were born here. Whether or not they were cricket fans or not, it was a way of gluing the community together and to focus on one thing, which is the West Indian cricket team. And I always say this, and I've said this repeatedly in many of the books I've written, that many of the people who were connected with the team, who felt they had to support the West Indies team, were not doing it because they were cricket fans. They were doing it because of what the West Indies meant to them, and also because of the brand of cricket they played, which was robust. It was exciting. It was full throttle. It took no prisoners, but it was entertaining at the same time.
So clearly a very significant tour to England, a tour that captured the imagination of a young 9-year-old watching the match on his new colour television. And are you still a big cricket fan today?
Yes, I am. I would say I'm a big cricket fan, but one of the things I always say to people is that I wouldn't say I was a sports writer or a sports journalist or a cricket expert. I talk about cricket. I'm interested in the game. It means a lot to me, particularly the West Indies team and various players from various other teams internationally that I've admired. But I wouldn't say I was a cricket expert. But yeah, I would say I'm a cricket fan, and I wouldn't say I'm head over heels in love with the game, because there's certain things about cricket that I don't like now. Just like football, there's many things about football now that I don't like. But I still feel connected with it because, I chose to support the West Indies at the age of 5 or 6. It's almost like an addiction. I can't shake it off. The same with Leeds United. It's just interesting that in 1973, I talk about Leeds United, I talk about the West Indies, and I talk about how important they were in terms of my connection with sport. And of course, Leeds United haven't been league champions since 1992. The West Indies haven't won a World Cup since 79. They haven't won
79.
And they haven't won a Test series in England since I think 88, if my memory serves me right.
Yeah, that's 88. They drew series in 91 and 95. Yeah.
Yes. So you could say I'm supporting lost causes, but I don't believe that. I'm just addicted to the West Indies and Leeds United for various reasons. And that's the thing about this book. It's about how people are connected to a sport and what it means to them. Not necessarily because they love the sport. It's what the team represents. And I think that's what's key in this book. And also one of the important things about 73, which I really, really underline in the book with metaphorical red pens, is that Rohan Kanhai was the captain, and Kanhai was Guyanese, the first Guyanese to captain the West Indies during a full Test series, which he did when the West Indies were hosting Australia before they came to England. So Rohan Kanhai was the first full-time Guyanese captain of the West Indies. He also was the first full-time West Indian captain of Indian Caribbean heritage, which again is something which tends to get overlooked, but that was very crucial to the development of the contribution to the West Indian team from the different ethnicities in the Caribbean. And when we talk about race and representation in the Caribbean, we have to talk about this team in 73, which gave people outside of the Caribbean a sense of how diverse the region is. We had people of Indo-Caribbean heritage playing for the team, Kalaturan, for example, Inshan Ali, for example, Rohan Kanhai, for example. People of African Caribbean heritage, Lance Gibbs, Clive Lloyd, Bernard Julian, for example. A player with Portuguese heritage, Steve Camacho. It was a team with people from different ethnic backgrounds in the Caribbean who were here to represent the region. I think that's very important that people can see, and you can only see it through cricket, really, that the team or the region is very, very mixed in terms of its diverse heritage. And that reflects the different types of people for different reasons who ended up in the Caribbean in the 1700s, 1800s, going back to the 1600s. Either they were taken there by force or they went there by their own free will.
Well, thank you for that. It's been very, very educational for me. I can see now the challenges there must be for anyone to select a West Indian team. England haven't won in the Caribbean since 2004. Yeah. What's your prediction on the 3-test series, which starts on March the 8th?
Well, England have only won one test series in the West Indies since 1968. For various reasons, the West Indies always do a lot better playing England in the West Indies than they do when they come to England, particularly since 1988, where they haven't won a test series in England. So, I mean, I'm not great at making predictions because I'm always worried that, I make a prediction and when I listen to a radio station and watch me on TV months later, I realise I might have got it wrong. It's always a bit of a tricky one. But I've just got the sense that the series is going to be a bit even. I think on paper, if England picked their strongest side, they would have probably a better squad of players. But I think at home, the West Indies generally give England a good run for their money. I'm not sure how much the Ashes defeat will have affected England. I'm not really sure. As we speak, the West Indies have beaten England 3-2 in the 2020 series. What effect that will have on the Test series, I'm not really sure. So I guess I'm fence sitting and thinking it might be, say, 1 draw, 1 win for each team. That I'll have to go on record and say that. Obviously, I want the West Indies to win the series, but I'll have to go on the record and say that.
Well, thank you for that. It's very much sitting on the fence. You can't get much more than 1-1-1, can you? So
exactly. I've got splinters on my backside now.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your test prediction and really talking about
Don't put any money on it, please. Don't put your mortgage on it or your rent money.
And for talking about your book, 1973 and Me. It's been a real pleasure, Colin, to speak to you. And thank you for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion.
Thank you very much. And I'll just have to mention that copies of 1973 and Me are still available from colinbabbauthor.com.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you for listening to The Paddock and the Pavilion. You can download the show on Apple Podcasts,
Amazon Music,
SoundCloud, Stitcher and Spotify.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at The Pad and Pav. Don't forget, if you like the show, please do leave us a rating and review.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Feel the whoa with Listerine at BJ's. You can save $2.50 now on Listerine products like Total Care Anti-Cavity Fluoride Fresh Mint Mouthwash or Cool Mint Pocket Packs Fresh Breath Strips at your nearest BJ's location. Experience the feeling of a million germs zapped in seconds with Listerine. Discount available through December 24th. Save now only at BJ's.